today too, just about metrics in general and what are marketers sort of valuing and basing decisions upon. It's a big deal. It's frequently, measurement is frequently pointed out in the media as the primary reason for this disparate nature of time spent on mobile devices and ad spend. I'm sure you've all seen the chart 100 times if you've seen it once. And I think that's, it's relevant that that sort of happened when the iPhone was introduced. And I think that particular platform really posed a particular challenge, which is was really twofold. One, and I don't know how many people in the room are so familiar with this, but the platform itself is very, very hard to measure in a traditional way. So traditionally on a PC, you put a meter on the device, you get opt-in panelists, and you can sort of see everything that everyone's doing with various levels of detail. You can sometimes see clickstream, you can see keyboard strokes, you can see referring sites, it helps out with attribution, it helps out with all kinds of things. On the iPhone, you couldn't do that. You couldn't really put a meter, at least not on a stock iPhone. You had to break your contract to be able to do that. So that posed a very unique measurement challenge from the very beginning. The other thing that's fairly obvious to probably everyone in the room and certainly to marketers is the lack of this sort of ubiquitous lack of a cookie. And that's compounded by, I think, the proliferation of apps. So about 80 to 85% of all time spent today on smartphones is inside mobile apps. So when you get that kind of a paradigm, it's a very, very difficult platform to measure. And that's sort of manifested in the world that we have today, where you've got multiple viewpoints on how and what to measure and how often. As a quick little background, I kind of got into the measurement business in about 2004. I met some guys out of Seattle that were starting a company called M-Metrics, and M-Metrics was one of the first companies, in fact maybe the first company, to really try to bring typical digital style audience measurement to mobile devices. Through a series of other steps, I ended up at Nielsen, and so I've been kind of thinking about this for more or less 9 or 10 years now, which either makes me the stupidest person in the world for not being able to figure this out, or it really is hard. I'd like to think it's the latter, and I might disagree. So to the first question, I actually want to go down the line here, given that setup and given the difficulties. These guys are all really leaders, and all these companies are leaders in this space. And each one of them brings a little bit of a different and unique component to measurement. There's sort of the pure play analytics. There's ad network kind of mixed in with it. There's various types of instrumentation, and each of these guys are measuring things a little bit differently. So I wanted to go down the line and each of you guys introduce yourself, your company, and then a short description of what you do and how you think about measurement and analytics for your clients.
Sure. So I'm Chad Gallagher with advertising.com. So we're the second largest global cross-platform ad network. And I head up mobile, but we come at this not just from a pure play mobile perspective, but really trying to understand across all devices, since that's really how most of our clients are looking at things. Not just mobile, but really across all devices what's actually happening.
Hi, my name is Sean Galligan. I'm VP of Sales and Business Development for Flurry. Flurry is a mobile measurement and advertising company. We have basically 3 core services: an analytics service that allows developers to understand how users are consuming their applications and behaving within their applications. We have a demand-side service that allows advertisers to reach the most targeted audience and most relevant audience for their brands, for their apps. And then we have a supply-side platform that allows publishers to more effectively monetize their audience.
Good afternoon, Brent, Hieggelke, CMO of Urban Airship. So we are not in the advertising business. We like to think ourselves in the relationship building business. And we do that through messaging from apps on behalf of brands and the customers that have downloaded those apps, through things like push notifications, which I think most people are familiar with, but also things like in-app messaging as well. So it's a combination of kind of those 2 things. And common use cases, so we do things like breaking news headlines for USA Today, your favorite sports scores for ESPN, daily deals for Groupon, that kind of thing. So really focused on engaging that customers, and I'll share my perspective throughout the panel on kind of the measurement challenges and opportunities and why people want to measure in that context.
Josh Williams, CEO at Kontagent. We help businesses measure and understand their customer experience inside their mobile applications and optimize their customer lifetime value. So really digging in deep into what users are experiencing and what knobs you can turn to improve their experience to really drive more value through your apps.
Excellent. So I thought we would maybe start with some of the real obvious stuff. So being also in the measurement business, we talk a lot about sort of I guess probably the most common metric, at least in advertising, probably globally, is about reach. So in mobile, that tends to be either monthly active users, daily active users. But I wanted to get each of your take a little bit on how important some of the other qualities of the mobile device are. And in particular, I kind of wanted to focus on time spent. And we talked a little bit about this earlier today, but there's sort of this notion, I think, that there's an inherent value in time spent from a consumer's perspective and from a publisher's perspective, really because that sort of relates more to opportunity to see, right? The more time you are on a particular publisher site or in front of a particular broadcaster's television station, a radio station, all this kind of thing, that can be relatively easily translated into these opportunity to see metrics, and that's what much of the advertising business in general is built on. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I've seen an increase in interest in time spent, but I know some of you have a little bit different opinions, and it kind of gets to this sort of engagement versus ROI discussion. And so, does anyone in particular want to kick this off? But I feel like there is this, and I'm not asking you to necessarily come down one side or the other, but maybe talk about how could time spent be relevant, and maybe how is it not relevant? Josh, you start.
Sure. So I think time spent is sort of a holdover, a transplant from TV advertising and a lot of kind of display-oriented web advertising. In mobile, I don't think it makes as much sense as a primary measure, except in specific applications. I think, Dave mentioned earlier, for apps like Pandora that monetize, primarily through CPM-driven campaigns, time spent matters a lot because you ultimately want the opportunity to present more impressions to your users. But for a lot of other applications on mobile devices, time spent is not a great metric. We check into our applications in pretty short bursts a lot of times, and ultimately what you need to understand as an app developer in a business is what value you're trying to drive in your application, and then define measures around that value. So generally, if you're trying to drive users to monetize and purchase, then what you care about is how much they're purchasing in a given time frame, and you want to look at cohorts of users and how much they cost to acquire for you versus how much you're spending, and start to optimize around that. And time spent isn't so much a relevant metric in examples like that. So I think people talk about it a lot, but probably goes to the broader problem and the issue that you're asking about, Dave, which is why is there such a big discrepancy between time spent on mobile applications and overall monetization rate for ads? And I think it's because a lot of the ways we're approaching mobile advertising today is sort of just transplanting things that we got accustomed to on the web, including banner ads and display ads, over to mobile applications where you can actually be a lot more effective if you customize.
Yeah, just to contrast, so certainly publishing sites, time spent matters a lot because that's how they make revenue. But a lot of apps are about efficiency. And so I'll use a really extreme example of a company that was sold this week to Facebook for a couple $100 million. Lenovo, and they were a customer of ours. Lenovo's big problem was that time spent in their app was like almost nil, because it was a background app. It saved you data and kind of maximize your experience behind the scenes. And so, for them, I'm guessing, I haven't talked to them recently, but I'm guessing that was an irrelevant app, an irrelevant metric. What was more important was, were people flipping on the Lenovo data savings features and leveraging it to save data? How much data had they been saving people? So, the reality is if you drop into a travel booking app or, a Starbucks app where you're trying to pay for your coffee as fast as possible, that metric becomes irrelevant. In fact, they probably are trying to get time spent down sometimes. So it's hard to throw everything in the same bucket because these apps, our phones are digital Swiss Army knives, I used that earlier in the panel, and I'll use it again, because they are, right? We use, I mean, I just found out I gotta take a red eye. I was telling you guys, I have to jump here. This is a day trip for me from Portland. I have to jump and fly on a plane to New York to deliver a keynote tomorrow morning. Without my iPhone, that would be kind of, dangerous. But today it's like, oh, no big deal. I can do it because I've got my Swiss Army knife with me, and I can handle every single thing pretty much in my left hand, right? So anyway, the context is so different.
So is that doing us a disservice? And I think we all know this chart that we're talking about. You see it across the different media types, and the metric is always time spent, and there's always that big delta. Do we think maybe that doesn't change for mobile, number one? And then also, is that actually, do you think any marketers are actually holding back because they see that, or do you think it actually is just sort of a media thing that they like to latch on to?
I think it's a good, big general metric. Right? It actually points to the opportunity that you might have. Right? If you look at our industry, right, you talk about the amount of time that people are spending within applications. David referenced upwards of 80% versus mobile web. But if you look at your average smartphone user, they're spending more time in apps than they are on the web anywhere, not just on the phone. So that's a great metric, right? That paints an opportunity picture that's really exciting. But I think if you start to really look down into different applications, it might be frequency of use, it might be retention, it might be getting to a certain level in the game or a certain category of experience that really matters.
I think for a while, we looked at the sequencing of app usage, right? And if you are a retailer, you might prefer to be sort of closer to that point when you turned on the device and you went here first and then here second. A lot of retailers and other people wanted to be real close to the Facebook section. That was sort of a metric for success that they use. So it sounds like you guys are. So it could be all over the place. It sounds like.
Yeah, so I would just add, I think time spent's a great metric, but I think the average marketer, that is not in their top 5 list of things they're actually looking to do. 1, 2, 3, and 4 drive more purchases, probably of some kind. And I think that, when I look at the biggest thing holding back mobile is often just education. So on the desktop side, everyone knows how a cookie works. Everybody has a metric for success on desktop that the whole organization has typically bought into. And now you shift into a medium where, the average person in marketing doesn't even understand how cookies work or don't work in mobile, don't know what they can track or can't track. And, you wonder, what's holding mobile back? And it's most of the companies we work with, even at the highest level, they don't know how things work. They're running campaigns they can't attribute correctly, and therefore it just becomes 1% of test budget, as opposed to actually running, significant campaigns. And when these companies start actually getting educated on how mobile works and understanding it's the future of their business, we find, the companies who actually understand, and we spend more time educating them, it opens up the doors for everything else. And I think, time spent is great, but I don't know. I think that, ultimately people are trying to drive purchases, right? So I think we can show things like time spent all day, but at the end of the day, people want to see how's their company getting ROI. What they're trying to do.
So it's actually a good segue to the next topic, which is that ROI measurement. And I'm wondering if you guys have some examples of how we heard a comment in the last panel that I think the summary was garbage in, garbage out. If you can only trust your data sources as much as they are reasonably accurate. So if you're building that into your model, there's some inherent risk there. Can you guys talk a little bit? There's been a ton of activity, I think, in that sort of closed loop ROI direction. I think it has some to do with the fact that you can tie an individual to an exposure, which is not necessarily the case with other media. But can you guys talk a little bit about some of the data sources you may or may not be using, or particular, you don't have to name names, but particular campaigns or accounts that you've worked on that you've really been able to deliver sort of an ROI type solution?
Well, so I'll start because since we're not advertising centric, we're in a bit of a different paradigm, which, we send out push notifications on behalf of brands. Most often, and we counsel our customers that these push notifications should not typically be promotional or marketing centric, but rather service-based, utility-based metrics. So things like Walgreens sending you a notification that your prescription's ready to be picked up. Starbucks sending you your balance after you just paid for your coffee, so you know you have $7 left. Those types of things. Now, they are very effective in marketing efforts because they do drive people to have a brand impression, communicate some value, and oftentimes do result in somebody opening an app. Maybe I'm going to go top off my Starbucks card, maybe I'm going to go get directions to the nearest Walgreens, that type of thing. So it becomes this different approach. Now the other thing is we've got a lot of media companies that use this for breaking news headlines. So when USA Today sends me a big breaking news headline, that may be all I need to know right at that moment. Like right now, if my phone were to light up, I probably wouldn't go open the app and read more because I'm busy at the moment. But 2 hours from now, I might go back and say, I want to read more about that story. Now there's some measurement challenges there because how do you measure if somebody looks at your push notification on your home screen? There's actually not a metric for that. Eyeball tracking isn't to that degree. Some people do swipe open a notification instantly, and then other people will go 10 hours later and they'll open the app because of the notification, but that's a really disconnected sequence of events. So it is hard to measure, and it presents a challenge where you do have to have educated clients, because if a client wants a click-through rate on a push notification, then they fundamentally don't understand how they should be using them in the first place.
As a company who does measurement and advertising, from a measurement perspective, through our analytics SDK, marketers can essentially measure the effectiveness of all of their marketing channels. And that level of effectiveness could be a click, it could be an install of an application, or it could be some action within that application that they've decided is a really strong signal for a quality user. So they can spend their money with ROI in mind, because they're able to measure all the channels that they use that drive high quality metrics for them. So we've worked with lots of different brands in this area. One example is with Kraft, the pool they have. They wanted to kind of drive social engagement with that application. It's a typical photo bomb application. So they were looking at all the different advertising channels that they used, who gave them reach to the audience that they thought reflected their brand and that they wanted the brand they wanted the consumer to engage with. And then they were able to track how effective all their different channels were at driving that social engagement. And we were able to not only be the measurement company that helped them track that, but also the advertising company, or one of the advertising companies that they worked with to engage with those consumers.
So we had a pretty interesting example. Actually, it was just this past Columbus Day. So because we run across all devices, and we also are lucky enough to have a significant amount of data to actually help us connect users to multiple devices, we're able to run some really interesting ROI analysis. So one example we just ran this past Columbus Day, a top 10 retailer where purchases are not just online but also in store. And you can imagine how mobile is an incredibly difficult medium to understand, especially when a lot of those purchases are not happening on the smartphone, right? So, and this is a classic example of someone who wants to advertise on mobile doesn't know what it's actually doing for them. So what we did was actually do a database match, matching our user base to their user base through a third-party data provider. And then actually attribute, take a control group, people who we didn't show an ad to over the Columbus Day weekend, against people who we did show ads to on mobile devices on Columbus Day weekend. Which is great, because now someone actually clicks on the ad and then maybe looks at a red dress but doesn't buy the red dress on their phone, and then goes into the store and makes the purchase. Now they can actually attribute that back to the original source. I think this is a huge step forward for the medium. And as we start seeing more campaigns like this, it kind of ends this massive attribution issue that we're facing in mobile right now. And I think we'll double, triple spends from marketers as they start understanding the power of what the medium's able to do.
Do you guys feel like that, like the whole ROI discussion is just very vertical centric? I mean, as you guys were talking, I remember, so we did a project with the Pandora last spring to measure tuning for premier divorce. Very typical experiment, control exposed, and then we looked on the TV panel and saw, who actually tuned into the program. Very sort of narrow definition of ROI, right? And I think some of you guys have pointed out some other, we typically talk about CPG. So, partnering up with back-end data providers, doing a database match, and then you can sort of run these experiments. It's sort of a rich man's problem in a way, right? Because all that stuff is very expensive to sort of execute. So do you guys feel like, is there this, do you feel like there's, we might be at the beginning of this sort of verticalized solution to ROI where you have, retailers actually, maybe we can touch on retailers for a second, because it seems to me like there's actually two different things for retail. There's app downloads, which is a gigantic business, which we could probably get into that measurement around app downloads and conversion. But there's also store visitation, which brings up location-based services and all this kind of stuff. You guys touch on just like, for retail, for just example, like, what is the ultimate, like, what do you feel like is the ultimate measurement there? And am I correct in this assumption that we're looking at this sort of verticalized solution?
Yeah, so I think broadly, it goes back to some of what we were talking about. You have to understand the purpose of your application. So if, for example, you're a retailer and your purpose is to drive maybe in-app purchases online based on some recommendation around the data that you have on a particular user, you would want to structure your application and measure things a certain way. If you want to drive people to your store and sort of offer them coupons and increase in-store average order value or something with your mobile application, you want to measure things a little differently. And I think for us at Kontagent anyhow, that's something we really try to partner with our customers on to define. And the key is that you have to think about things in a mobile-centric way. You have to look at user value and user data over time, not the typical kind of web-oriented metrics. Like Brian mentioned, talking about CTRs and time in app, they're first proxy kind of transplants from what we all got accustomed to on the web. But you can go actually much further with mobile after you get you develop the expertise that Chad was talking about, and you kind of get comfortable with mobile and learn to leverage mobile channels and build applications with purpose and then measure that purpose. You can actually get much richer data today in mobile than we ever could on the web, and it's much more accurate because you have the persistency of the device.
I think the big challenge is, there's several challenges. One is, what's the I in ROI? What is the investment? What are you talking about? Are you talking about the entire omni-channel strategy? Because you got big retailers now saying there's a chief omni-channel officer, right? That looks at Macy's was one of the first big companies that did this, where they said, the problem with mobile is mobile's everything. Mobile's every single channel. You have Walmart out there and a lot of other stores now developing store modes for their app. So if I'm in the aisle, I flip the app over to store mode. So, if they're going to make me, the consumer, be really clunky and trying to validate that app shopping experience while I'm in the aisle connects, people aren't going to do that. Maybe occasionally for a coupon or something like that, but they're not going to, integrate every single thing they buy into the app in the store, and they have 3 kids running around and they're trying to get home and make dinner. It's just unrealistic. So, there's a big challenge with that, and some of it's a leap of faith. You have to look around. I've heard talk to people where they're like 40% of moms are shopping at these stores with their phones because they're so damn busy. And they're multitasking constantly. So you just got to look around and see that to know what's happening. But I know specifically one of the other things that we've done a study on push notifications overall because of the challenge I mentioned earlier, which is sometimes the notification is the payoff. But in aggregate, one of the things we studied was how do people in general engage over a long period of time if they receive notifications versus those that opt out, because push notifications are opt-in. And so in general, there's a 400% lift in engagement for people that receive notifications versus those that don't. And then interestingly, it doubles retention rates, which is not directly related, but when you start thinking about the fact that when apps start sending you value in the notification, not marketing, but actual utility value, that alone could be a reason to keep an app on your phone. That notification can be serving you on a daily basis, and people will, twice keep that app on the phone twice as long as those apps are out. So,
yeah, I think our objective is to help advertisers figure out what are those valuable segments to them? Right? What are the audience segments that create the most value for the brand, for that experience? And then, obviously help them reach them. But, I think kind of like you alluded to, understand what are the signals that lead up to what the event is that builds value, right? So for shopping, it's a transaction, right? For travel, for a game, it can be an in-app purchase. But there's a lot of signals in behavior that lead up to that action. And so that is something that we help our advertising partners with every day, understanding what those segments look like, what those personas of those individuals look like that are going to transact or book or perform some action within their application, and then give them the ability to reach them and measure that engagement and measure the value or ROI.
It seems like, we have talked a lot about really post-buy measurement, but you're right, there are two sides of the coin, right, when it comes to measurement. There's certainly all the signals that you can see in advance of an event. You can, we call it precision marketing, some might call it targeting. So the better that predictive model is, right, the more sort of likely that the campaign's going to be on target and the better lift you're going to get. Are any of you guys measuring, sort of what we think about as typical like brand lift metrics or purchase funnel metrics, just via survey, whether that's either purchase intent or likability or anything? Are you guys doing any kind of measurements like that?
Yeah, through our analytics, our acquisition analytics and user acquisition analytics, you can set up essentially funnels and create events that build towards a transaction. And then they can obviously set up an event or an action track that ends up being some kind of transaction. So yeah, helping them understand what that flow and that path looks like to try and drive towards a transaction is a big part of what people are using in their engaging with our research.
So maybe this is just me. I feel like surveys are a pretty massive waste of time. My experience has been the results always come back from a survey that brand lift was massive, and everyone who filled out the survey now loves the brand. And I think that it's just, honestly, I think you can just do a lot better. When you look at things like being able to actually understand purchases across any device or true lift, I think that's what actually moves the needle. And I think that surveys are fine, but I think the fact of the matter is, if mobile keeps trying to play in a medium where we're looking at things like click-through rates or surveys, my personal opinion is that it's always going to be 1% to 2% of the marketing mix, right? And when we actually start looking at things holistically and how it's actually moving massive amounts of business, right? 1/3 of all purchases online now happen on a mobile device. It's just a crazy statistic. That's what gets our clients super excited, is that we're actually able to move business. So I'm not to be like the negative survey guy.
Well, yeah, I agree with the point in general that, going back to it, that, we need to look at things differently in mobile now, and I think that is the reason why you see the big gap between time spent and essentially advertising value and efficacy. It maps over in other ways as well. Yeah, a lot of businesses, now say mobile drives a huge portion of their actual transaction value, but they still don't have a lot of insight around the funneling and how users get to that value. And there are new things, around push and device-specific location that we really can do a great job today measuring, but a lot of people just don't know how to do it. So I think as that expertise develops over time and people get comfortable with it, we'll see the gap close. But another big problem is that the channels aren't really there yet. There aren't a lot of great innovative advertising channels. Like when we look at the most effective advertising campaigns for our customers, they're effective when the business understands, again, what value they're trying to drive specifically, and they set up accurate measurements around it. And typically that's really hard to do in-house because there's a lot of vagaries of collecting accurate data on mobile. And the third piece is they have to really experiment with the channels that they're advertising across and have accurate attribution across those channels. And that lets you get a holistic picture of cost to acquire and then ultimately the value that you're deriving from the campaigns. And it is hard to stitch that together today, but you can do it, and it's really effective when you do. And for us, once you have that data, you can actually go a lot further because it's more accurate, more granular data. So one thing we work on a lot are these predictive models, where if we have accurate kind of early signals of user value, we can actually show you what your expected lifetime value is, or what your value from a particular user cohort is going to be over, the next 7 days, 30 days, 90 days. And that's something that's on the web really hard to do because value was measured differently and data wasn't as clean. But on mobile, it's actually possible. So there's a huge opportunity, to capture, I think now, but people haven't, we haven't gotten there yet. I think in terms of our mindset, at least in the advertising community, and really clearly identifying what we want to measure.
So I think that's a dovetailing on that point a little bit, and also back to one thing that Chad said. Do you guys feel like, so there's this, I'm sure everybody in the room has read all this press in the last 3 months intensely, but maybe for six or 9 months the conversation has been ongoing. But just this notion of the death of the cookie, right, and how, driven by things like programmatic, data exchanges, things of that nature, it seems to be getting less relevant. I wonder if what was sort of billed as mobile's biggest detriment early on turns out to be its biggest advantage at the end of the day, if it changes the entire industry and the way we look at it. But I want to get your opinion on the logical conclusion of this argument, at least as it's played out in the press, is that companies who have some kind of visibility into their users, either across apps on a smartphone or across the media touch points in general, have this massive advantage, right? Because you do have this omni-channel view of what the customer is doing at the end of the day. If that plays out, like a lot of people in the press think it might, what does a smaller, and by smaller, I really mean 10, 15, 20 million unique users type app, down to the 2 to 5 range, what do they do if they're not sort of Facebook, AOL, Google, Apple?
So I'm a biased party here. I'm not sure I'm allowed to answer the question. But I do think what you're going to see, so fundamentally, I think the space is moving in a direction of going across all platforms. Right? I think that there's no doubt about that. And I think that the days of a siloed mobile universe are quickly ending. That's regardless of this question. It's just a fundamental belief that we have, and we're seeing play out, especially with the more innovative companies, but more and more with every company. So I think that that's the case. I think that folks need to, what you're going to sort of see is that cross-channel data is going to start to become available to lots of different companies in lots of different ways. So, I mean, you mentioned a few companies that obviously have that data, but I think that you're going to see 4 to 5 companies, us probably being one of them, that will start to surface this data for lots of folks to use in lots of different ways. So I think the answer to your question is, it's not so much, if you're a company that doesn't have the data, it doesn't mean that you have to have the data, right? I think you can get access to this cross-channel data to start using it in unique ways. I mean, the really cool example I use is we're now seeing retail companies start to leverage some of our data to better understand how users are becoming a new user for their company on any device through incredibly innovative ways. And a lot of these companies don't, they may not have access to that data themselves, right? It's not first-party data, but they can access it through a lot of different ways, whether it's their DMP or a company like ours. I think that's the future, right? It's not necessarily, if you don't have the data first-party, you can still get access to it through a lot of different ways. I think, I would encourage people to start challenging their partners to think like this, because I think there's lots of different solutions you're going to start seeing in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, I think we're one of those partners that can help that small company, not just compete with the Facebooks and Twitters and Googles, but get a leg up on them. So from our perspective, we see more mobile devices every month than Facebook, Google, and Twitter. I think we're monitoring about 1.2 billion devices versus Facebook's just under 900 and Google's just under 8 million. So we're a partner that can help them leverage that data and that view to try and find the right kind of audience, or to try and target the right kind of advertisement to the right kind of user. We feel, while the cross-channel use case or advertising method is really interesting, and I think it's really effective in certain cases, we just feel like the personas of individuals across devices varies pretty great, and so we feel like that's a better signal for us. So on my smartphone, I might be a casual gamer, a lot of the time, but on my iPad at home, I'm a huge shopper and business traveler. And so the idea is that we want to make sure that we're targeting and focusing advertising towards the right segment and at the right time with the right device.
So then are you then saying that you're not, ideally it doesn't particularly matter to target you on a smartphone with a shopping message because you're not in that mindset of shopping, you're in sort of gaming, and maybe you're more entertainment focused?
Yeah, we just see that your persona that you fit into may vary based on your device, and that's one signal, right? There's lots of things that we track. Time of day could be a device, right? I may not be a shopper during the day, but at nighttime, I'm definitely a shopper. So we just view the notion of having access to a data marketing partner as a huge asset to a small developer, to marketers out there that aren't able to leverage what Facebook can do.
One last tiny question I'm going to break for questions. Related to that, let's say that is the direction that the market goes. One thing that occurs to me is, companies always want to know how they do competitively. Retailers want to know how they stack up against other guys. All the streaming music companies want to know how they stack up against the other guys. This sort of New World Order doesn't particularly allow for that, I don't think. So does anybody want to sort of talk about, Josh, maybe you can comment on just how does a company look competitively? How do you know if you're performing better than the other guys?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, there are services out there that help you get a sense for how you stack up against your competitors, in app stores, so companies like App Annie or Distimo, in terms of how you're monetizing and what your sort of audience looks like. And then there are benchmarking, tools that you can do, kind of data sharing, but you have to figure out what you want to benchmark against, right? Which again is where we try to help customers. I think today in mobile, it's quite a volatile market. So what you actually want to benchmark against typically is just yourself, your prior performance, and how different cohorts of users that came in at different times and through different channels perform. So you're constantly improving that. Benchmarking against a specific competitor or application, there are ways to do that and estimate it. Obviously, for us, customer data is sacred and private, so we would never expose competitor data or benchmarking. But you can get kind of estimates out there. Our typical recommendation though is benchmark against yourself and improve, because across the board in mobile it's volatile and there's just a great deal of improvement. All app developers can, I think, strive for to customize and optimize their apps.
Right. Makes sense.